The desert didn't measure time in days, but in degrees of thirst. It was a kiln of raw ochre and burnt sienna, where the sun hammered the horizon flat and the wind was a file against the skin. For 10 years, Fletcher Knox had learned its language, a dialect of silence spoken in the crackle of shale under a boot heel and the dry rasp of a lizard's breath. His ranch wasn't a home, it was a truce. A low-slung adobe house, a corral of sun-bleached timber, and a well that was more a prayer than a certainty, all huddled in the shallow cup of a stony basin, a tiny island of stubborn life in an ocean of shimmering heat. At 34, Fletcher wore the landscape on his face. The lines around his eyes were etched by a squint against a relentless glare, his skin tanned to the color of old saddle leather. He was a man whittled down to his essentials: bone, muscle, and a quiet that ran so deep it seemed to bleed into the vast emptiness around him. He moved with the spare economy of a man who knows any wasted motion is wasted sweat, and any wasted sweat is a debt to the earth that might not be repaid. Solitude was his bedrock. It had been a choice once, after the noise of the war and the hollow ache of the world that followed. Here the only ghosts were the dust devils that danced on the flats, and the only arguments were with a stubborn mule. This morning the silence was different. It was heavier, pressed down by a sky the color of a faded bruise. He'd been mending a split rail on the far side of the corral, the rhythmic thud of his hammer the only pulse in the world, when he felt it. A shift in the weight of the air, a stillness where there should have been the scuttling of some unseen thing. He set the hammer down, his hand drifting instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, 6 cartridges in the cylinder. His eyes, the pale blue of a desert sky at dawn, scanned the jumble of rust-colored boulders that marked the edge of his claim. Nothing. But the feeling remained, a prickle on the back of his neck that had kept him alive more than once. He walked the perimeter, his steps soundless in the dust, his gaze missing nothing. The Winchester rifle, leaning against the adobe wall of the house, seemed a mile away. He found the boy behind the rain barrel, wedged into the narrow space between the cool, water-stained wood and the sun-baked adobe. He was a scrap of a thing, maybe 7 or 8 years old, a tangle of black hair and wide, terrified eyes. His skin was stretched taut over a rack of sharp ribs, his lips cracked and swollen. He wore only a breechcloth, and his small brown body was a map of recent violence. The angry red welts of a whip crisscrossed his back and shoulders, some fresh enough to have bled through the dirt caked on his skin. He didn't cry out or move. He just stared, frozen, a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. An Apache boy. Fletcher had seen their raiding parties from a distance, phantoms of dust and fury, but never a child, never like this. Fletcher felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was trouble of a kind he had spent a decade avoiding. This was not a dust devil or a stubborn mule. This was the world, with all its noise and pain, come knocking at his door. He held up his empty hands, palms forward, a gesture he hoped the boy would understand. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The boy flinched at the sound, pressing himself harder against the wall, his eyes darting toward the open expanse of the desert as if gauging an impossible escape. He was starving. It was in the hollows of his cheeks, the desperate fire in his eyes. Fletcher backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the child. He went inside the cool dimness of his house. The place was sparse, a cot, a table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth. On the table lay the last of his loaf of bread, a hard, crusty thing he'd been rationing. Without a second thought, he picked it up, along with a tin cup of water from the bucket by the door. When he returned, the boy hadn't moved. Fletcher knelt, placing the bread and water on the ground a few feet from him, then retreated to the porch steps, sitting down with a deliberate slowness. He didn't look at the boy directly, instead busying himself with rolling a cigarette, his movements methodical and calm. He was creating a space of non-threat, a pocket of peace in the boy's terror. For a long time nothing happened. The sun climbed, bleaching the colors from the land. The only sound was the faint hiss of Fletcher's cigarette. Then, a flicker of movement. The boy's hand, thin as a bird's claw, crept from his side. It snaked out, snatched the bread, and retreated in a single fluid motion. He devoured it with a ravenous desperation that was painful to watch, cramming the hard crust into his mouth, his throat working convulsively. He drank the water the same way, gulping it down, spilling half of it down his chin in his haste. When he was done, he looked at Fletcher, a flicker of something other than terror in his dark eyes. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was a dawning awareness, a question. Fletcher gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He had made his choice in the simple human gesture of sharing his last piece of bread. He had drawn a line in the dust, and on the other side of it was this small, broken child. He didn't know the boy's name, or what horrors he was fleeing, or what horrors might be pursuing him. He only knew that you didn't leave a child to die of thirst and hunger, beaten and alone in the desert. It was a moral equation as simple and unyielding as the landscape itself. As the boy's breathing slowly deepened, the edge of his fear softening into a profound exhaustion, Fletcher felt the weight of his solitude settle around him again. But it was different now. It was no longer just his own. He had unknowingly taken on the boy's, and in doing so, invited a reckoning he could not yet fathom. The sun beat down, the truce was broken, and the silence of the desert waited to be filled with the answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. The boy slept for 18 hours, a sleep so deep it was like a small death. Fletcher had carried him inside, his body weighing almost nothing, and laid him on his own cot. He'd cleaned the boy's wounds as best he could with a rag and warm water, the child barely stirring under his touch. The welts were brutal, laid on with a practiced, vicious hand. This wasn't a casual beating. This was a punishment, formal and cruel. Fletcher sat at his table through the long night, the Winchester across his lap, watching the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest. 18 bullets. 6 in the Colt, 12 for the Winchester. He counted them in his mind, a grim and useless rosary. Against what? He didn't know. But the desert had taught him that the most dangerous threats were the ones you couldn't see, the ones that came on the wind. The dawn arrived not with a soft glow, but as a sharp, silver blade cutting across the eastern mesas. Fletcher was outside, watching the light reclaim the land, when he saw them. At first, they were just a shimmer on the horizon, a trick of the heat. Then the shimmer resolved into form, into a line of riders materializing from the earth itself. They were not a band, but an army. They flowed over the low ridges, silent as smoke, their movements disciplined and fluid. They were Apache. Fletcher's gut went cold. He didn't run for the house. There was no point. He simply stood by the porch, his arms crossed, and waited. They didn't charge. They didn't shout. Their approach was more terrifying than any war cry. They fanned out, forming a perfect silent circle around his ranch, each warrior an equal distance from the next. 200 of them, Fletcher guessed, maybe more. Each man sat his pony with an unearthly stillness, armed with a rifle or a bow, their faces impassive, their dark eyes fixed on the small adobe house. The encirclement was absolute, a living wall of lethal patience. The air grew thick, heavy with their collective will. It was a siege not of noise and fury, but of pure, suffocating presence. The world shrank to the size of Fletcher's property, a stage surrounded by silent judges. After an eternity that might have been 10 minutes, one rider detached himself from the circle and walked his horse toward the house. He was an older man, his face a mask of deep carved lines and old sorrows. He wore a single eagle feather in his long, gray-streaked hair, and his presence radiated an authority that was as natural and potent as a thunderstorm. This was a chief. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the porch, his eyes black and piercing, locking onto Fletcher's. "You have something that is not yours," the chief said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and carried easily in the still morning air. He spoke English with a formal, clipped precision. Fletcher didn't move. "I have a guest," he said, his own voice steady. "He is not a guest," the chief countered, his gaze unblinking. "He's a fugitive from Apache law. He is my nephew. His name is Taza, but you would call him Little Wolf." The door to the house creaked open. The boy, Little Wolf, stood in the doorway, drawn by the voices. He was swallowed by one of Fletcher's old shirts, but his eyes were clear. Seeing the chief, he gasped, a small, wounded sound, and shrank back behind the doorframe, his brief recovery shattered. The chief's gaze flickered to the boy, and for an instant, a profound pain crossed his features, so quick Fletcher almost missed it. Then it was gone, replaced by the granite mask of command. "The boy has committed a great crime," the chief said, his voice hardening. "He broke into the sacred kiva and stole the seed corn, the corn blessed by the spirits for the new planting. He has endangered the future of our people for the sake of his own belly." Fletcher thought of the starving, desperate child he had found. "He's a boy. He was hungry. He is the son of a chief and my sister's child. He is to be the future of the people," the man said, his words like stones. "He knew the law. The law is the law. It is what holds us together." From the sash at his waist, the chief drew a whip. It was a short, heavy-looking thing made of braided rawhide, its tip stained dark. He held it up, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. His punishment was decreed by the elders, 40 lashes, so that he would never forget his duty to the people over himself. He received 20 before he ran. He must be returned to us to receive the rest, and to face the shame he has brought upon my house. Fletcher's blood ran cold. He looked at the whip, then at the sliver of the boy hiding in the doorway. He pictured that brutal lash falling on the child's already broken skin. 20 more times. A quiet, unyielding certainty rose in him, solid as a mountain. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical thing, a force that straightened his spine. "No," Fletcher said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the immense silence with the force of a gunshot. The chief's eyes narrowed. The 200 warriors around them seemed to lean forward as one, a subtle shift that tightened the circle, that made the air crackle. "You are one man," the chief Standing Bear said. "You have a house of mud and a few bullets. We are the Apache. We can wait for you to die of thirst, or we can end you now and tear your house apart to find him. Give me the boy." This was the moment. The crucible. Fletcher felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him, the crushing pressure of an entire nation's will. He could surrender the boy. He could save his own life, his ranch, his solitude. It was the sensible thing to do. The boy was not his. The law was not his. But as he looked past the impassive chief to the ring of silent warriors, he saw not an enemy, but men bound by a tradition so rigid it would brutalize a child for the crime of being hungry. And in that moment, Fletcher's quiet, solitary existence found its purpose. He was terrified. A cold sweat trickled down his back. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was one man against a storm, and he was about to defy the lightning. He counted his bullets again, a frantic, silent litany. 6 in the Colt, 12 in the Winchester. It was an act of pure, insane courage. Moral terror gripped him, the fear of a violent death warring with the shame of an unbearable choice. To hand over the boy would be to kill something inside himself, something more vital than his own heartbeat. Instead of reaching for his gun, Fletcher took a step forward, off the porch and onto the dusty ground that separated him from the chief. He held his hands out, empty, away from his body. "You are Chief Standing Bear," he said, guessing the name from whispers he'd heard over the years, a name spoken with fear and respect. "Your people tell stories of your wisdom, not just your strength." Standing Bear's expression did not change, but a flicker of surprise showed in his eyes. "You say the boy must learn his duty to the people," Fletcher continued, his voice gaining strength. "But what he has learned from you so far is fear. Fear of the law, fear of his own kin. Look at him." Fletcher gestured toward the house without looking back. He is terrified of the whip, but what he is truly starving for is not food. It's a reason to be the leader you want him to be. This was an unbelievable gamble, a shot in the dark. Fletcher was speaking across a chasm of culture, language, and law. You want to teach him a lesson. Let me teach him one. Let him stay with me. For one moon. A murmur went through the assembled warriors, a rustle of disbelief. Standing Bear's hand tightened on the whip. You are a white man. What lesson can you teach an Apache chief's son? I can teach him that a man's strength is not in the hand that holds the whip, but in the hand that offers bread, Fletcher said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. I can teach him that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting rightly in spite of it. You want him to be wise? Then let him learn a different kind of wisdom. Let him see our world, not as an enemy, but through the eyes of one man who showed him mercy. He paused, letting the words hang in the tense air. He was proposing the impossible, asking a war chief to entrust the future leader of his people, a fugitive, to a solitary white rancher. It was madness. And what do you gain, white man? Standing Bear asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Why risk your life for an Apache boy who is not your blood? Fletcher looked the chief dead in the eye. Because I was a boy once too, and I was hungry, and no one came. He said it simply, without self-pity, a flat statement of a forgotten truth. The words landed, striking a chord of shared humanity that transcended the rifle and the whip. For a long moment, Standing Bear was silent. He looked from Fletcher to the house where his nephew was hiding, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He was a man of tradition, a guardian of the law, but he was also an uncle who had seen the terror in his sister's son's eyes. Fletcher had not offered a challenge of arms, but a challenge of honor, of wisdom. To refuse would be to admit that the Apache way could only be taught through fear. To accept was a risk of unimaginable proportions. Finally, Standing Bear spoke. 1 moon, he said, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. He will stay in your house. You will teach him your ways. But you will be his keeper. If he runs, we will hunt you both. If any harm comes to him, your life is forfeit. When the moon is full again, I will return, and he will return with me to face the judgment of the elders. And you, he added, his gaze impossibly sharp, will answer for him. He turned his horse without another word, raising a hand. The silent ring of warriors dissolved as fluidly as it had formed, melting back into the desert landscape, leaving behind only the dust and the oppressive silence. Fletcher stood alone in the center of the vast, empty space, his heart still pounding. He had faced down a war party, not with bullets, but with a plea. He had won. Or he had just begun a new, more dangerous kind of war. He turned and looked at the house. Little Wolf was standing fully in the doorway now, his small face a mixture of awe, confusion, and a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Fletcher had just gambled his life on the soul of a child. Now, he had 1 moon to make sure it paid off. The first week was a conversation spoken in silence. The ranch, once a vessel for Fletcher's solitude, now held a new and fragile tension. Little Wolf was a ghost in the house, moving with a liquid stillness, his eyes missing nothing. He watched Fletcher saddle his horse, mend his tools, cook his meager meals. He was an observer, a student of survival, absorbing the rhythms of Fletcher's life. He ate everything Fletcher put before him, but his hunger seemed to have moved deeper, becoming a hunger for understanding. He would not speak. He would sit for hours by the window, staring out at the desert that had been both his home and his tormentor, his face a small, unreadable mask. Fletcher did not push him. He understood that the boy's silence was a shield, the only armor he had left. Instead, Fletcher spoke, filling the quiet with a low, steady monologue as he worked. He talked about the land, the names of the plants that could heal and the ones that could kill. He explained the mechanics of the well pump, the patient logic of a knot, the way to read the clouds for rain. He wasn't lecturing, He was simply thinking aloud, including the boy in the landscape of his own mind. He was giving the boy words for the world he now inhabited, a new set of tools to replace the fear. "This is a cinch knot," Fletcher said one afternoon, repairing a saddle girth. "You pull it tight, and the harder the horse pulls, the tighter it holds. Some things are like that. The more you fight them, the more trapped you get." Little Wolf, sitting on an upturned bucket, watched Fletcher's hands, his dark eyes following the intricate path of the leather thong. He didn't respond, but Fletcher saw his small hands mimic the movement in the air. Slowly, a change began. It started with small gestures. One morning, Fletcher awoke to find the woodbox by the hearth, which had been nearly empty, was now full. He hadn't heard the boy leave or return. A few days later, while Fletcher was re-shoeing his mule, a task that required a third hand he didn't have, Little Wolf stepped forward without a word and braced the mule's hoof, his small frame firm and steady. They worked together, a silent team, the clang of the hammer on the anvil, the only sound between them. Fletcher began to test the boy, leaving small tasks for him. A harness to be oiled, a bucket to be filled. They were always done, completed with a quiet efficiency that spoke of an ingrained discipline Fletcher was only just beginning to grasp. He was not just the chief's nephew. He was the product of a culture that valued action over words, observation over instruction. Fletcher realized he wasn't teaching the boy the white man's ways, so much as giving him a space to let his own innate character surface, free from the shadow of the whip. The true turning point came during the third week. A dust storm blew in from the west, a roiling brown wall that swallowed the sun and scourged the land with sand and fury. For 2 days they were sealed inside the small adobe house, the world outside a screaming chaos. The wind howled like a tortured animal, and sand forced its way through every crack, coating everything in a fine, gritty powder. On the second night, with the storm at its peak, Fletcher was checking the shutter on the window when a powerful gust tore it from its leather hinges. The wind and sand blasted into the room, extinguishing the lamp and plunging them into a maelstrom of darkness and noise. Fletcher fumbled for the shutter, fighting the incredible pressure of the wind, his fingers raw and stinging. He couldn't get a grip. Suddenly, a small body was beside him in the dark, pressing against his side, adding its weight to his. Little Wolf's hands found the shutter, his small fingers finding a hold where Fletcher's could not. Together, they wrestled the heavy wooden plank back into place, forcing it against the frame, and Fletcher managed to jam a chair against it to hold it fast. They stood there for a moment in the roaring dark, breathing heavily, their shoulders touching. "Taza," the boy said. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the storm, but it was clear. Fletcher froze. It was the first word he had spoken. "My name is Taza," the boy repeated. "I'm Fletcher," Fletcher said, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was enough. The dam of silence had broken. Later that night, huddled by the faint glow of the hearth's embers, the boy began to talk. He spoke of his crime, not with excuses, but with a child's simple, devastating logic. He hadn't stolen the sacred corn to defy the spirits. He had done it because his youngest cousin, a girl of 3, was wasting away, her cries of hunger a constant, piercing ache in the camp. The hunters had come back empty for weeks, and the people were rationing. He knew it was wrong, but the sound of her crying was louder than the voice of the law in his head. He had been caught, and the shame was not in the theft, but in being caught. The punishment that followed was a public spectacle, designed to restore the honor of his uncle's house. He hadn't fled from the pain of the whip, he explained. He had fled from his uncle's eyes, from the look of cold disappointment that hurt more than any lash. Fletcher listened, the story painting a picture far more complex than he had imagined. It wasn't a simple case of a hungry boy. It was a tangle of love, duty, pride, and a child's desperate, misguided attempt to solve a problem far bigger than himself. He saw now the true nature of Standing Bear's pain, the conflict between his duty as a chief and his love for his nephew. Courage, Fletcher said softly, looking into the fire, is not always about being strong enough to follow the law. Sometimes, it's about being strong enough to see when the law is breaking someone's spirit. You did a brave thing for your cousin, even if it was the wrong thing. In the days that followed, the ranch was transformed. The silence was replaced by questions, by the boy's insatiable curiosity. He learned the English words for everything, his mind a thirsty sponge. He learned to count Fletcher's bullets with him, understanding the grim arithmetic of their situation. 6 in the Colt, he would murmur, his small finger tracing the number in the dust. 12 in the Winchester. He was no longer a fugitive, but a partner. They rode the boundaries of the ranch together, Fletcher teaching him to track settlers' boots as well as a deer's hoof prints, to tell the difference between the dust of a rider and the dust of the wind. In turn, Taza, he was Taza now, not Little Wolf, taught Fletcher the Apache names for the stars that wheeled overhead in the vast, clear nights, stories of the trickster coyote and the river of spirits that flowed across the sky. Fletcher was no longer just his keeper. He was his teacher, his student, and his friend. The 30 days were drawing to a close, the moon swelling to a silver disk in the night sky. The ranch was no longer a lonely outpost. It had become a sanctuary, a neutral ground where two worlds had met and found a common language. But Fletcher knew this peace was borrowed time. Standing Bear was coming back. And beyond the horizon, another kind of storm was gathering, one born of greed and hatred, far more destructive than any desert wind. The air had grown heavy again, but this time it wasn't the weight of an Apache siege or an approaching storm. It was the greasy, thick air of trouble, the kind that smelled of whiskey and stale tobacco. For 2 days, Fletcher had seen riders on the high mesas to the east, indistinct figures who watched his ranch and disappeared when he looked too long. They weren't Apache. Their movements were clumsy, arrogant. They were white men. Fletcher knew the name before he ever saw the face: Jeremiah Wade, a territorial marshal with a tin star and a soul full of poison. Wade had been making a name for himself across the territory, a self-appointed Indian hunter who preached a gospel of fear and extermination. He saw the Apache not as a people, but as a pestilence, and his solution was a simple, brutal one. Any rumor of unrest, any stolen cow, was fuel for his fire, an excuse to gather a posse of frightened, angry men and ride out to dispense his own brand of justice. On the 29th day, the day before Standing Bear was due to return, they came. They did not come with the silent, disciplined dread of the Apache. They came with torches and shouts, a drunken, chaotic mob of about 30 men, their faces flushed with whiskey and self-righteous fury. They swarmed into the basin, their horses trampling the fragile earth, their voices tearing the evening quiet to shreds. At their head was Wade, a thick-set man with a florid face and pale, piggish eyes that glittered with ambition. He wore his marshal's star pinned crookedly to a dusty vest. "Knox!" Wade bellowed, his voice slurring slightly. "We know you got him in there, the heathen brat who killed the Miller boy. We're here for him." Fletcher stood on his porch, the Winchester held loosely in his hands. Taza was behind him, inside the house, silent and still. The Miller boy? Fletcher's mind raced. He'd heard of it, a settler's son found dead weeks ago, 20 miles east. The blame had been laid, as it always was, on the Apache, with no proof. It was the excuse Wade needed. "You're mistaken, Marshal," Fletcher said, his voice cold and even. "There's no killer here." "Don't you lie to me, Knox," Wade spat, gesturing with his pistol at the men behind him. They were a mix of farmers and townsmen, their faces a blend of fear and bravado, their eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight. "We got a witness. Said he saw an Apache boy near the Miller farm the day it happened. We're taking him in. A rope is too good for his kind." "You're on my land, Wade," Fletcher said, his knuckles white on the stock of the Winchester. "And you're not taking anyone." He knew this was a lie, a pretext. Wade didn't care about the Miller boy. He cared about igniting a war, Capturing or killing the Apache chief's nephew would be the spark he needed to set the whole territory ablaze, a fire from which he would emerge a hero. "You a squaw man now, Knox?" one of the posse members jeered. "Hiding behind a murderer?" The circle of men tightened, their torches casting long, dancing shadows that made the scene feel like a vision from hell. They were an inverse of the Apache encirclement, loud where the warriors were silent, chaotic where they were disciplined, driven by a sputtering, ugly hatred where the Apache were moved by cold, hard law. Fletcher felt the familiar grim litany start in his head. 12 shots in the rifle, 6 in the Colt, against 30 men. The odds were impossible. His stand was pure bluff, a wall of moral conviction against a tide of armed ignorance. The standoff stretched, thick and volatile. Wade seemed to be enjoying it, savoring the moment, the power he held over this lone man. "Last chance, Knox. Send the boy out, or we burn you out." As a man with a torch stepped forward, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the steady, deliberate beat of a horse's hooves. Then another, and another. From the west, cresting the ridge in the dying light, a line of riders appeared. At their head was Standing Bear, his face like carved stone, the setting sun glinting off the rifle held across his lap. Behind him, silent and terrible, fanned out the 200 warriors. They had returned, a day early. The posse froze. Their drunken bravado evaporated in an instant, replaced by a stark, primal fear. The jeers died in their throats. They were no longer a righteous mob confronting a lone man. They were a handful of drunks caught between a rock and a hard place. And the hard place was an Apache war party. Wade's face paled, the flush of whiskey draining away. He had wanted to start a war, but he hadn't planned on it starting here, tonight, with him in the middle. The world held its breath. 3 factions, a triangle of imminent violence. Fletcher, the solitary man of conscience. Wade, the agent of chaos and prejudice. Standing Bear, the embodiment of inexorable law. The Apache warriors sat their ponies with that same terrifying stillness, their eyes, like chips of obsidian, taking in the scene. Standing Bear's gaze moved from the torch-wielding posse to Fletcher on the porch, and then to Wade. His expression was unreadable, but a cold fire burned in the depths of his eyes. He had returned to find his nephew, the future of his people, threatened by a white man's mob. "Marshal," Fletcher said, his voice low but carrying in the sudden, deathly silence. "You have made a grave mistake." Wade, trapped, swung his pistol toward Fletcher. "This is your fault, Knox. You brought this on us." It was the breaking point, the moment when the talking stops and the shooting starts. Fletcher braced himself, his finger tightening on the trigger. Standing Bear raised his hand, a signal that would unleash hell. And then, the door behind Fletcher opened. Taza stepped out onto the porch. He was no longer the frightened, starving child Fletcher had found. He was dressed in the clean shirt and trousers Fletcher had given him, but he stood with a posture that was entirely his own. It was the posture of a chief's son. He was not cowering. His face was calm, his eyes clear and resolute. He stepped past Fletcher to the edge of the porch, in full view of everyone. He looked first at the posse, his gaze sweeping over their frightened, hateful faces. Then he turned to his uncle, Standing Bear, meeting his eyes without fear. Finally, he looked at the open space between the 3 groups, and he began to speak. He spoke in the liquid, flowing tongue of the Apache. His voice was not loud, but it was filled with a startling authority that commanded the attention of every man present. He spoke for a long time, his hands gesturing, not with anger, but with a powerful, declarative grace. Fletcher couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He could see it in the shifting expressions on the faces of the Apache warriors. He could see it in the way Standing Bear's rigid posture seemed to soften, the granite of his face showing cracks of surprise, then respect, then a deep, resonant pride. Just as Taza finished, another rider galloped into the basin, this one from the south. "Hold your fire!" In the name of the law! It was Sheriff Tom Bradley, a tall, honorable man with a weary face, followed by 3 deputies. He'd obviously heard about Wade's mob and had ridden hard to intercept them. He skidded his horse to a halt, his eyes taking in the impossible, explosive tableau. Taza looked at Fletcher, and for the first time, spoke in English, his voice clear and steady for all to hear. "I will translate," he said. He turned back to the crowd. "I told my people that this man," he pointed a small, steady finger at Fletcher, "is a man of honor. He did not shelter a murderer. He sheltered a hungry boy. He taught me that justice is not the same as vengeance, and that strength is not the same as cruelty. He is my brother." He then looked directly at Wade. "I told them that you seek war for your own glory, that you use the name of a dead boy to water the ground with the blood of others. The Apache did not kill the Miller child. We know who did. Raiders from the South, outlaws who wear the face of no tribe. Our scouts saw their trail. You do not seek justice for that boy. You seek only power." Finally, he faced his uncle. "And I told my chief that I am ready to return. I stole the sacred corn. It was a crime against my people. I did it not for myself, but for another who was suffering. It was an act of love done in the wrong way. I am ready to accept the judgment of the elders. But I will not be punished out of fear. I will be judged by the wisdom I have learned, the wisdom of my people, and the wisdom of my white brother, Fletcher Knox." The silence that followed was absolute. A child's voice had shattered the standoff. It had disarmed the hatred, redefined the law, and offered a path forward that wasn't paved with bodies. It was an act of courage so profound it left every armed man in the basin speechless. Sheriff Bradley was the first to move. He dismounted, his shotgun held at port. "Wade," he said, his voice ringing with legal authority, "you're under arrest for inciting a riot and attempting to obstruct justice. Your posse is to disarm and disperse, or you'll all be facing a federal judge." Wade sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, but the fight had gone out of him. His men, sobered by fear and the presence of legitimate law, began to back away, dropping their torches, their brief, ugly power extinguished. Standing Bear watched this, his face still a mask, but his eyes were fixed on his nephew. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, of respect. He had sent a frightened boy away to learn a lesson, and a future chief had returned. The risk Fletcher had taken, the gamble on a shared humanity, had paid off in a way neither of them could have ever predicted. The tension broke, not in a volley of gunfire, but in the quiet click of Sheriff Bradley's handcuffs closing around Marshal Wade's wrists. The aftermath was quieter than the standoff, but carried a more profound weight. Wade's posse melted away into the darkness, a scattered flock of shamed and frightened men, leaving the disgraced marshal in the custody of Sheriff Bradley and his deputies. Bradley gave Fletcher a long, searching look, a look of grudging respect. "You walk a dangerous line, Knox," he said before leading his prisoner away. "Seems you know which side you're on." When they were gone, the basin was left to Fletcher, Taza, and the 200 Apache warriors who stood as silent witnesses under the rising moon. The air was finally clean, stripped of the stench of whiskey and hate. Standing Bear dismounted and walked toward the porch, stopping before his nephew. He did not carry the whip. He placed a hand on Taza's shoulder, a gesture of immense significance. He looked from the boy to Fletcher. "You have kept your word," Standing Bear said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a treaty. "He has the heart of a boy, but the voice of a chief. You have taught him something new." "He taught me too," Fletcher replied honestly. "Tomorrow, you will ride with us to our camp," Standing Bear stated. It was not a question. "You will speak to the elders. You will tell them what you have seen." The journey to the Apache stronghold was a silent passage through a world Fletcher had only ever seen from a distance. They rode through hidden canyons and across high, wind-swept mesas, the warriors moving with the silent grace of ghosts. Fletcher rode beside Taza, who no longer seemed small, but filled with a quiet, confident purpose. The ranch, Fletcher's entire world for a decade, shrank behind him, a tiny speck in the immensity of the land. The Apache camp was a living thing, nestled in a valley protected by sheer rock walls, a secret heart beating within the mountains. Before the council of elders, in the smoky confines of a large lodge, Fletcher spoke. He told them of the starving boy he had found, of the choice he had made. He spoke of Taza's silence, his diligence, his courage during the storm. He described the standoff with Wade's posse, and the moment Taza had stepped forward to speak truth to all three sides. He didn't ask for mercy for the boy. He simply bore witness to his transformation. When he finished, Taza stood. He spoke to the elders, his voice clear and strong. He acknowledged his crime and the shame he had brought. He accepted their judgment. But he also spoke of what he had learned, that mercy was a kind of strength, that understanding could be a sharper weapon than a rifle, and that a bridge between two peoples could be built on the honor of a single man. The elders deliberated. In the end, the judgment was wise. Taza's remaining punishment was nullified, replaced by a duty. He would be responsible for opening a line of communication with Sheriff Bradley, to share information about renegades and outlaws, to build a peace based on mutual law, not mutual fear. His crime had led, through a strange and winding path, to a new responsibility. His path to leadership was no longer in question. It was secured. Fletcher rode back to his ranch alone, but the solitude felt different. It was no longer an escape from the world, but a quiet space filled with the echoes of connection. His home was no longer just an outpost. It had been a crucible, a fortress, a sanctuary, and now a symbol. A few weeks later, a gift appeared at the edge of his property line. 2 magnificent horses, a fine Apache blanket, and a pouch of the very seed corn that had started it all. There was no note. None was needed. Fletcher's life found a new rhythm. He was still a solitary man, the landscape still his primary companion, but the silence was now punctuated by visitors. Sometimes it was Taza, who would ride in not as a fugitive, but as a friend, sharing news and sitting in comfortable quiet on the porch. Sometimes it was Standing Bear himself, who would come to speak with Fletcher, man to man, about the difficult and fragile peace they were trying to nurture. The ranch had become what Taza's speech had willed it to be, a neutral ground, a place of diplomacy. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the basin, Fletcher stood on his porch, watching Taza ride off toward the mountains. The boy, the young man, sat his horse with an easy grace, the future of his people resting on his strong young shoulders. Fletcher's gaze fell upon his own hands, calloused and weathered from years of solitary work. They had cleaned wounds, offered bread, fought a storm, and held a rifle they never fired. Trust, home, love. He had learned they were not things to be found, but things to be built, one splinter and scar at a time. The desert was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but for the first time in a decade, Fletcher Knox felt truly at home within it. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a bridge, and he had earned a name he would never hear spoken, but would carry for the rest of his days, the white brother of a future Apache chief. The peace was a hard-won, fragile thing, but like his small adobe house in the vastness of the desert, it was real. It was enough.